In this video, we're going to talk about namespaces, what they are, how to use them, and best practices. A namespace is a way to provide more scopes to your program. So first, let's talk a little bit about scopes again. The two main kind of scopes we've talked about are the global scope, which is like effectively everything. Once that variable is declared, it can be seen anywhere within that file. So A here can be accessed from within main. And then there's also the block scope, which is defined between two curly braces. So in this case, B is in block scope and can only be seen within these two curly braces, making it, in this case, effectively useless. C is also within block scope of main. So we can see when we go print it out, we can see the variable A, we cannot see B, so it's commented out, and we can see A. So when we run this program, we should see 1, 3 being printed out. And there we are. So, let's start talking about namespaces now. A namespace allows us to break the scope of our program into smaller, more manageable chunks, into scopes called namespaces. To create a namespace, we can use the namespace keyword followed by the name of the namespace. So why do we want these? Well, there's really a limit to how many useful and reasonable names we can come up with for functions and variables, and they can't conflict because one identifier can't point to two different values. So we can use namespaces to break that up. So not everything is in the global scope or within the block scope. It also makes the code slightly more readable sometimes. So, in this case, we have my space, and then within this, you have two curly braces, and then all your variables and functions. So in this case, we have an int, a float, and a boolean. And then, when we go to access them, it's not quite as simple as just stating the variable, like normal. You need to use a new operator, the colon operator, otherwise known as the scope resolution operator. And that's because it resolves the scope of A. It tells the compiler that A, in this case, is part of my space. So, if we remove these comments and we run it, we're going to get an error. If we leave the comments in here, you can see that this tells the compiler that A is part of my space. Otherwise, it doesn't know what A is. And then here, now we have two what would be conflicting names. Both variables are called B. So when we go to print B, it's going to print the one in the scope it knows. So it's going to print 2.1 as we see below. And then when we go to, if we want to print the B in my space, we have to tell the compiler that B is part of my space using the scope resolution operator. So it prints 3.2. We can also assign values to variables using the same idea. Now we're going to talk about nesting namespaces. Namespaces can be nested, meaning you can put a namespace within another namespace. So here we have our my space namespace, and then we have space2, which holds an int. In order to access Z, you can't just use my space : and you can't use space2 : you have to use both of them with two scope resolution operators. This tells it to look inside main space and inside space2. When we run this, we'll see 4, the expected value. We're going to talk about the using keyword now. The using keyword is a way to bring more than one variable into the current scope at a time. There's two different ways to use it. The first one imports or brings in the entire namespace into the current scope. So now in the current scope we have all the variables and functions from my space. So when we want to print A, we can just say A. That we don't need any scope resolution operator. And if we want to print Z, we can use the scope resolution operator just once because it's already brought the other space in. If we run it, we'll see that it works as expected. The other way to use using is to bring in just one object from the namespace. So, std is a namespace. That's why, as we've been printing out, you see std : cout and endl. And without those, it wouldn't know where to look for cout and endl, and it'd throw an error. But let's say you're using cout a lot. You can use using std : cout, and then you don't need to write std every time. You can just write cout. But note that that only brings in the cout. So you still have to do std : for endl or anything else from the standard library. And when using the using keyword, you want to be careful about cluttering the current scope with large namespaces. So the std namespace is very large and contains lots of functions. So you normally don't want to import the entire space, like here, into the current scope, as it would clutter it. But with a smaller one, like MySpace, with only 3 variables, is acceptable. Namespaces are an important part of C++, so I suggest you take some time to mess around with them by yourself, and then I'll see you in the next video.